7 years and counting. In Syria, new fronts replace old ones as the deaths run in the hundreds of thousands, the displaced in the millions. Aleppo has fallen. ISIS may be on the ropes, but there's still plenty of bloodshed, what with the pro-Assad offensive to retake the eastern Ghouta enclave near Damascus, fighting in Idlib province, and a new standoff at the northern border as Turkey tries to push out Kurdish YPG militias from Afrin. How to curtail the suffering thanks to Russia and Iran? Assad certainly has the momentum, but how much power does he really have? Beyond brute force, what's the strategy for year 8 of this civil war? And yes, there will be a year 8. The civil war in neighboring Lebanon, by the way, that lasted 15 years and resulted in a cold peace between rival communities. For now, to hope for a cold peace in Syria seems, well, wildly optimistic. Where to look for light at the end of the tunnel? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at 7 years of war, and with us is Yahya al-Abdullah, an academic and an activist who left his native Aleppo in 2012. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Also with us, he's a Dubai-based journalist, Sakar Edris, who is from Homs.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you a lot.
And France 24 senior correspondent James Andre. We're going to see some of your reporting a little bit later on. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. 7 years ago, March 15th, 2011, Syrians themselves surprised to see protests swell in Dara over the crackdown that followed anti-Assad graffiti. Back then, there was no civil war. There was no Islamic State. Clément Bonnereau has the story.
It all started here in Deraa, southern Syria, on March the 15th, 2011. Inspired by protests rippling through the Arab world, teenagers daubed anti-Assad graffiti on the streets. They were arrested and tortured. At least one was killed. That was the spark that lit the Syrian revolution. Before long, anti-regime protests spread to Homs, Aleppo, and eventually Damascus, the seat of the regime. Months later, the Free Syrian Army was established, and later the formal political opposition. As the violence escalated, the revolution soon morphed into a civil war. Front lines became entrenched and civilians trapped. The government, and to a lesser extent the rebels, encircled, besieged and bombarded neighbourhoods, trying to starve civilians into surrender. By 2013, some 90,000 people had been killed. By 2015, it was 250,000, and the UN officially abandoned trying to count the dead. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has reported more than 350,000 documented deaths to date, but says the unofficial death toll could be as high as 500,000. The conflict has always been far more than a fight between the regime and rebels. Right from the start, the opposition was deeply factionalized. Islamists opposed to the Western-backed moderate rebels soon started growing in authority. A chemical attack in eastern Ghouta in 2013 looked like it might draw the US in, and for a while Assad's grip on power looked shaky. But the US strike never materialized, and Assad was emboldened. More chemical attacks followed. And then came the intervention of Russia in support of the Assad regime, a decisive moment in the war that saw the government win back the second city of Aleppo. All the while, in eastern Syria, the Islamic State group was growing a sizable fighting force, taking territory and further fracturing the opposition. Syrians fled the country in their millions. As the refugee crisis reached Europe's door, calls grew to end the bloodshed. Faltering UN peace talks produced the odd ceasefire, but no meaningful breakthrough. Meanwhile, Russia, Iran and Turkey launched their own round of talks in Astana and then Sochi, also with limited success. Today, Syria's war is more complex and international than ever. Government forces control 2/3 of the country, with rebels and the Islamic State group still present in a few pockets of land. Kurdish militias, meanwhile, occupy much of the north, but Turkey and allied forces launched an operation to clear them from the region in January. As Syria's war enters its 8th year, Assad's hold on power looks strong. Tens of thousands still live under siege, and more than 9 million people remain displaced.
Yahya Al-Abdullah, do you remember where you were on March the 15th, 2011?
I was at the University of Aleppo, and I was doing my master's degree there. And I remember one of the first things I wanted to do as a student is to say something about what was happening. That was not specifically the 15th of March. That was a couple of weeks after that. I agreed with some of my colleagues and classmates.
Because at first it was peaceful protests.
Definitely.
And were you surprised to see those protests?
Definitely not.
You weren't surprised?
Of course I was not surprised, because that was something that was very much expected to happen in Syria. If you just look at the history, the modern history of the country since Assad, the father, took over the power at the beginning of the 1970s. And if we look at the history of the Ba'ath Party and how the Ba'ath Party's ideology and practices, if you like, switched and shifted into something completely different from its original track after the presence of Hafez al-Assad in the middle of the party. I was never surprised, because there has been many different attempts that have been oppressed and terminated in the most brutal way possible. So having something like that would never be a surprise. Was never a surprise to me.
That's an important point, which sometimes viewers who look at this from the outside don't realize, is that there were protests in the past, some violent, others not. People think of the massacre that took place in Hama in 1982 perpetrated by the government of Assad's father. It's unclear how many people were slaughtered in that one. Did that mean, when this uprising, this peaceful uprising begins in 2011, that there could be no going back, that it could only end in bloodshed?
Well, let me tell you, first of all, the oppression, massacres is like history in Syria. It's nothing new. It's not emergent situation. As you said, in 1982, which is like the people they came to know, but before that, even it was undercover. Also, there is in Palmyra prison, it was another massacre against like the detainees, political detainees. Also, about 1,500 were killed at that time. In 2011, it was, well, by the way, I still call it revolution. Maybe other people, they call it conflict, civil war, whatever. I still call it revolution because, well, there is no Yves Saint Laurent revolution, no Versace revolution, just like French revolution, like other revolution, because it was, in the beginning, it was peaceful, like demand from the Syrian
more
civilians for reform, exactly,
more openness, less corruption.
Exactly, and the report was mentioned. It's mentioned in the report. It was like a spark. It was the spark of this movement. It was torturing the kids, and at least one was killed at that time. If you remember in Dara, it's mentioned in the report. So,
but very quickly it becomes sectarian.
Well, actually, it was planned, because I will tell you something. For example, there is a very well-known, peaceful, intellectual Syrian, his name Abdul Aziz al-Khayyar, who is from Kurdaha, the city, the village of Assad family. He was detained because he has a lot of followers, like demanding the peaceful reform. At the same time, like a lot of extremists and Islamists, they were released from the jail. It was in the beginning of 2011. Now, most of the released people, extremists, they are like war lords now in Syria. So whether Nusra Front, whether ISIS, whether or other extremist organization. They were released. But someone like Abdulaziz al-Khair, he was detained because he was asking for like peaceful reform, for peaceful revolution. So that's why
it wasn't sectarian.
It was planned. It wasn't sectarian, but the Assad regime and its alliance, like Hezbollah, like Iran, they want to show that it's sectarian war.
I'd like to comment on 2 points here. First of all, like everybody talks about the massacre in Hama in 1982, which is a massive thing and something we should always talk about. But I would like to mention a couple of other things that happened prior to that. Nobody talks about them much. For example, in 1979, all the unions, all the syndicats, more specifically, wanted to go in March, the beginning of March 1979, to go against the rule of Ba'ath Party with as it is, like it was the 17th anniversary of the rule of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, and this peaceful revolution as well, this peaceful uprising was oppressed. Most of the people, like doctors, engineers.
So that was all. This is under Hafez al-Assad. People thought in 2011, and we were having discussions on this very set at the time. In 2011, people thought, well, Bashar is not Hafez al-Assad. Did you think that?
Exactly.
No, I did not think that, because I don't think we can separate the two periods, right? Like, we started with a very systematic, a very long process of taking over the power, taking over the throne. For me, Syria is like the closest example of a monarchy, and the closest example of taking over power according to the theory of Ibn Khaldun, the state. And please let me mention that one of the most important books that have been published about Syria, I believe, was in 2011. And recently, last year, 2017, it was translated to Arabic. It's a book by Michel Seurat, a French sociologist, and he talks a lot about the practices of the Assad regime. And he mentions the 1979 uprising of the syndicats, the teachers, the architects, the doctors, you name it. And he mentions another massacre that took place in Jisr al-Shughur, 1980. 200 people were publicly massacred. And nobody talks about that, right?
James Andre, the Assad father, Assad son, same thing?
Well, the fact of the matter is that Hafez al-Assad did implement a very brutal regime in Syria. That is well documented. Hama is a good example. Indeed, the massacres you were talking about, many other practices. As you were saying, the killing of over 1,000 political prisoners in the prison in Palmyra is also very well documented. The fact of the matter is, when indeed the son came into power, there was a slight hope within the country that indeed he would be different. He did open up by saying, I will make reform. But and this is what you were talking about as well. It's also around Assad, there is, the Syrian deep state. There are muhabarat, there are all the state institutions who are there to also guarantee that this system carries on. And even if Bashar al-Assad had wanted to change,
it's a winner-take-all system.
In a sense, but the winner probably does take all, but he's also influenced by all this apparatus that is in place, that was inherited by Hafez al-Assad. And indeed, the fact of the matter is he did not change the system. But there's also this uprising, which obviously, from his standpoint at the time, probably had to be, stopped. And then, as we know, things got extremely violent and bloody. In the very first place, tell me if I'm mistaken, but people on the streets were asking for changes, but not actually the fall of Bashar al-Assad.
They were asking for reform, but unfortunately the intelligence, Syrian intelligence or Assad intelligence, just like they mislead the people by calling for other statements to kill Alawis, to kill. So it was planned inside, as you said, the deep state.
To turn it into a
exactly conflict. To turn it into that.
Before we go to the break, Yahya Abdullah, let me ask you a little bit about your personal tale, because you leave the country's largest city, Aleppo, in 2012, in March of 2012, so early into the uprising.
Exactly.
Or the revolution, as you call it.
It is a revolution, I would call it as well.
And at the time, Aleppo, which is home to lots of trade and commerce, sort of staying on the sidelines of it.
Not exactly, because as a student I was part of what I would call a movement, a revolutionary movement, a peaceful revolutionary movement. But unfortunately, we were like really, our hands were very tied and short because
And you felt it was unsafe for yourself.
well, yes, as many others. But let me just tell you why it was very difficult. Because the regime used a very specific, horrible tactics in Aleppo specifically. That is basically recruiting local communities from the people who were the enemies to the regime, because they were known as smugglers and drug dealers and weapon dealers and whatnot. Their task was basically to oppress any attempt for a peaceful demonstration. They were supposed to be ready in place within 10 minutes once they get the call. So that's why, for example, exactly, that's why we, like, those are what we call shabiha as well. Those are the ones who made us follow we started calling our demonstration flying demonstrations, which means up to 10 minutes. So we could not do much. And of course, I left my bag downstairs, and my bag has books and my computer all the time. Just right now, they would come with all kind of weapons. Most of the time we would see the police just watching, because it would look to anyone, even if you were there filming, like two groups of civilians having two different demonstrations.
Right.
But that was not the reality.
Trying to instill the violence from the start. When we come back, we're going to look at where Syria can go now and how there could be light at the end of the tunnel. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. 7 years and counting for Syria's civil war. We're talking about in the company of Yahya al-Abdullah, who left his native Aleppo back in 2012, an academic and activist based here in Paris and in Glasgow.
Yes.
And in Glasgow as well. Sakar Edris is from Homs, a journalist who is Dubai-based, and with us as well, France 24 senior correspondent James Andre. Last November, James, you went to Deir el-Zor province after having covered the fall of Raqqa. Because when we're talking about, obviously, the difference between the 6th anniversary and the 7th anniversary of Syria's civil war, the big difference is ISIS has been pushed out. For most parts. You go to Deir el-Zor province, that is just after pro-Assad forces took towns from Islamic State militants. But no sooner the jihadists gone, that there's sort of this tension that spikes. The Euphrates River is there. On the one side, you've got the pro-Assad forces. And on the other side, you've got the Kurdish-led forces.
Yeah, exactly. The Kurdish-led forces who are north. This is a bit of an informal agreement between Russia and the United States, basically, that everything south or southwest of Euphrates River is indeed, under Syrian government and Russian control, whereas everything that's north of the river is indeed more in the hands of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are, built around the YPG.
And those 2,000 U.S. special forces that are there as advisors, they're in that yellow bit that we see?
They're in that yellow bit, absolutely. Part of them are. They're actually spread across, and they were there. I saw them actually when we were covering this this offensive in Deir el-Zor. What we witnessed was basically a race. With both the coalition-backed Kurdish forces on one side of the river racing to Bukamal, and on the south we had the Russian-backed government forces rushing to Bukamal as well. Bukamal is a very strategic city. Why? Because it is on the border between Iraq and Syria. It is a passage point. The Americans see it as a place that can be used by Iran, for example, to send troops or whatever.
Yeah, that famous Shia highway that they denounced,
exactly.
that would run from Tehran to the Israeli border.
Exactly, the Shia highway that the American administration sees. Well, that's in Bukamal, and they were hoping to indeed implement an army base there. Well, they lost that race, and in fact, the government won. But when we were there, we saw the end of it, and we did see a lot of tension because These are Arab villages along the river. They were being taken by a force which is mostly Kurdish and seen locally as a Kurdish force. And as you will see, that did spark a lot of tension. Shenan village was just retaken from the Islamic State group by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Dead jihadi fighters still litter the streets. As we drive by, an old man is being roughed up by an SDF fighter.
You say you're not part of the Islamic State group. I swear I'm not with them. I'm sick. I have diabetes. Just kill me now. Let's just end this now.
Calm down, sir. Calm down.
I swear I'm not with them. I have diabetes and a bad heart. He beat me. Why did he beat me? That's not good. Look, I'm trembling. Why did you hit me? I've done nothing to you.
The fighters are weary. They fear enemies might be hiding among the locals.
Why didn't you answer when I asked you where the IS fighters are? You said I can't talk. Why can't you talk? You didn't ask me that. You said you're with Islamic State straight away and beat me. Since you're so sure of yourself, why did you lose your temper? Why did you break your phone?
Of course, the cameras are rolling, so I suspect that encounter would not have gone down the same way if you hadn't been there.
Probably not. Actually, we arrived in a 4x4 vehicle, and at that precise moment, the soldier was beating the older man up. Now, what's interesting about this sequence is it really shows that there is no trust, in fact, between the Sunni Arabs, which live in that part of the country, and I mean this includes Raqqa. The YPG people in charge know full well that they cannot control Raqqa for a very long time. They have indeed retaken it, but it is an Arab Sunni city, and indeed it has to be ruled. It was ruled for a very long time by indeed what you described, a very strong central government that could use pretty brutal tactics. But what these people wanted was self-rule. And this is basically also the starting point of the Islamic State group. Because indeed a lot of people say that Assad liberated a lot of jihadists from his prisons. But the fact of the matter is the Islamic State group spilt over from Iraq, where it was the exact same situation. As in, this was Shia government in Iraq that was, not giving any space to the Sunnis. I mean, if you go back in time, indeed, the Sunnis were in power for a very long time. That was Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni. But they found themselves marginalized, not listened to. Same thing in Syria. And indeed, that spilt over the border. It actually started in Iraq. But it's true that the jihadization of what happened in Syria, it's also along the same mechanism. The majority of the population, who are Sunni Arabs in Syria, have felt marginalized for a very long time. And just to come back to talk about, more the rest of the war, the fact is that foreign countries have also been spilling money in and have turned, and I don't know if you agree, but have turned what was a peaceful uprising into a bit of a jihad. Nevertheless, when Turkey spills money in, when Qatar spills money in, when Saudi spills...
If you want to say not Turkey, even Iran, do you think, just like most of the Syrian, they know, in addition to the government, worldwide governments, I'm not talking about the people, that ISIS is made of intelligence, international community intelligence, and Iran and Syria regime is involved. Let me continue. Okay. Let me continue. In 2015, November exactly, Department of Treasury, the American Department of Treasury, they just publish a report in November, like in 15 November, they publish a report about the business relationship between ISIS, Syria regime, and Russia. In addition to that,
okay.
Let me continue.
Go ahead,
let me continue. It doesn't mean that we consider ISIS like a group of gangs, psycho gangs. Okay, some of them, they have this ideology about jihadist ideology, but also there are kind of leaders, special leaders, part of intelligence. Because few months back,
but this was
113 members of jihadists, they were defected and they joined the
Sakar Idris, just one point. That next week we're going to be speaking to journalist Rania Abu Zaid, who's just written a book about this, and she describes that period, the early days of the civil war, 2011, 2012, where you have this sort of one-upmanship with all of these patron states and private citizens pouring money in a disorganized fashion, and the more you seemed hardline, the more money you got, and it just at that point, it all got more and more and more hard line, it seems.
And it's true also.
I think this, maybe you'll be surprised about what I'm going to say, that I guess the international community just like used Syrian to attract their jihadists to be placed in Syria, then to get rid out of them. Because if you want to just like analyze, put ISIS on the table, analyze it, you will find a few Syrian out of ISIS. Most of ISIS jihadists, they are non-Syrian. They are whether European, American, Australian, or Iraqi.
To me, there are two layers in ISIS. I've seen this in Iraq as well, because I've worked on ISIS a lot in Iraq. And in Iraq, I saw the very, very beginning of what ISIS was going to become. And this was back at the end of 2011. I met with some Sunni sheikhs in Ramadi, and they told me, we are sick and tired of central government in Iraq, and we are going to take the sons who we have left, and we are going to fight them if they carry on not taking into account our interests. And I interviewed these people, and next thing you know, 2 years later, you have ISIS. The fact of the matter is, it's also based on a popular base of support. Now, on the Iraqi side, it's quite clear that it was organized by former officers
former Iraqi military
yes,
army,
which had been kicked out and which had been completely ostracized, and who were very powerful people, generals, colonels from Saddam Hussein's army, who knew how to organize people, and indeed they surfed on popular dissatisfaction. But you see, there were certainly fights between factions as to who was going to control Raqqa.
Exactly.
But when Raqqa fell into the hands of the Islamic State group, a large part of the population who didn't know they were going to be beheading people and implementing what they did later on under the influence of foreign jihadists.
That's why I
were
said
quite happy and felt liberated. You see what I mean? There is this.
Yeah, I would like to throw something on the table right there. First of all, thanks for mentioning that ISIS started in Iraq and it's a spillover to Syria, and I would say it's even before 2011.
But there was already Al-Qaeda, there was already the Al-Nusra Front. There was all
myself.
Great, but my concern or my question is, there are two important things about ISIS in Syria. The first one is ISIS never fought Assad regime. ISIS went with the policy that we want to purify the liberated areas. So they were going to areas that were already controlled by Free Syrian Army and other militias. Fine.
That's true.
They took over these places and they kind of installed their laws and whatnot, and they were not even attacked even once, 2013, by the Assad regime.
Let
me just finish my point,
into
please.
The hands of both parties.
What about battles?
But that made a very problematic thing we are not talking about here, because at the time of barrel bombing in Aleppo, the countryside and other places, people had to run away. And when at the time of something like that, at the time of a catastrophe like that, people would choose the safe place. And I can tell you, many people started heading east.
Of course,
to ISIS-controlled areas. You know why? Not because they are the incubators,
but they knew that both sides were giving each other a wide berth. That the Assad government wasn't hitting the.
There you go. ISIS was the best servant for Assad purposes. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist.
No. But
however, I know people who went east, and I was fighting hard not to let people go east towards ISIS because it was safe. This is number one. Number two. Back on the point of the ISIS fighters, I think it is unfair to say there are only few Syrians.
No.
Let's say that there are a little bit more than few.
Comparing to others, this is what I'm saying.
Definitely.
Comparing to the large number of ISIS members and fighters, Syrians are less than.
Yeah, definitely. But when you are in a place where it is secure, when your country is being bombed by its leader, by its regime, by its army, supported by other armies, such as the Iranians. Hezbollah was there from the beginning. The Iranians were there from the beginning. The Russians had
absolutely.
yes, even before that, not officially, they did not announce it before 2015, but like there is, Syria is the only country in the world where Russia has military bases. So
Exactly.
the Russians were there from
They
the
wanna
very beginning.
find feed.
Yeah, let's call white eggs, and
All right, and even if ISIS is being pushed out, their impact will be felt for a long time, fueling that distrust between communities. We've seen it the last couple of days with the siege of eastern Ghouta near Damascus, a rebel-held enclave, where some of the residents who've been interviewed on the pro-regime side have said, we don't want to welcome the civilians here. They're all with the radicals. They're all with the terrorists, as they put it. How do you get these two communities to reconcile down the road?
This is what we have to work in. Actually, Syria, still have a hard time. So actually, the Syrian or Assad regime, I don't call it Syrian even, because we have now to really defuel the hate speech among Syrians. So this hate speech has to be like eliminated among Syrians, whether pro-regime or against regime. Finally, we are Syrian. We have to live with each other. But the problem that Assad is like, not Assad also, as he mentioned, that deep state. They don't want to leave. And Syria, it can't go back before 2011 because cannot like they were considering Syria as like a farm. They are ruling or controlling this farm. So actually, unfortunately, we find this like hate speech was fueled and still fueled among Syrians, whether a pro-regime or against regime. It needs a lot of work actually to really eliminate this hate speech. We were surprised, shocked about what you said, what you mentioned, that like other civilians, supposed to be civilians, they are in regime area. They were just like really,
because they've been the target of rockets
exactly.
coming out of this.
They were like really happy when they like see or watching kids are dying. They are just saying, well, okay, those kids are terrorists or son or family of terrorists. They have to be killed. So I guess I blame that. To the regime. Really, I bear the responsibility to the regime and. Because they occupied the Syrian civilians pro-regime with this hate speech.
But the thing is, isn't at one stage, it's true, it is a fact that, all these organizations, Fatah al-Sham and, others, who are, indeed, some of them are affiliated with...
Just to tell you,
yes.
If I'm talking, I'm against Assad, I'm against Daesh, I'm against Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm against Jaish al-Islam, I'm against Farq al-Rahman, I'm against Ahrar al-Sham, I'm against all of these armed phenomenons. Okay. I'm just with civilian to tell you that. And we are fighting all of that.
So what happens next, James Andre? Because you've got that siege right now in eastern Ghouta. You have the fighting in Idlib province, not to mention this Turkish offensive across the border in the north in Afrin. What does year 8 have in store for us?
Well, look, what I believe, I'm afraid I reckon the Ghouta is going to fall. And I reckon the Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, is going to fall to the hands of, indeed, the regime. They will reassess control over it. It will probably be the same in Idlib. That'll be the next step. And then...
And when we see one of the, the agreements we've seen in other places where the rebels can move out and go somewhere else?
Well, the question is we going to run out of places where the rebels can actually go? But just... The thing is, indeed, it does appear no one's going to stop the Russians and the regime at this stage. I mean, West doesn't have the clout right now unless they actually send people on the ground.
Except the US holds that bit in yellow that we saw yesterday, and they're going to keep that.
Yes, but for the moment they're under attack by Turkey, and they're in a very difficult situation because they are backing a Kurdish militia which is considered as a terrorist organization by Turkey. And when it was going to come for the US to choosing between Turkey, which is a NATO ally and a major economy, and what is basically a Kurdish forces or communist militia, the chances are they're probably going to choose Turkey. And this is what's happening right now. They've not done anything to, help or save the YPG in Afrin for the moment, where they are actually losing their piece of land. Now, the big question mark is, and this is going to be, I believe, the biggest question mark in in year 8, is that all the political demands of the Sunni Arabs in the country have not been met. None of them. All of the root causes of what started this in the first place, and then what turned it, what made, the Islamic State appear, what made the jihadi movements prosper in the country, are totally unaddressed. They're exactly in the same state they were in 2011. Bashar al-Assad is still in power. It's still not an inclusive government. There is still no compromise as to how to govern the country. Now, these people are most certainly unhappy about that. Now their cities have been destroyed, and they've lost a large part of their own families most of the time. Now, they are the majority group in the country. Now, what happens next? My bet is that potentially we'll see how things go, but in the eastern part of the country, you might see a new ISIS rise when people will see the state Raqqa, the city of Raqqa is, I visited it, there's nothing left of it. When they see that, when they see what's left of their lives, and they are back under the rule that was
a lot of
there
mines
prior,
also.
There will probably be something worse than the Islamic State.
So it's the question of what does the international community do so that.
There are two things actually about what you said. First of all, I would like to disagree with you that Assad is still in power, because he's not. I would say
he governs over two-thirds of the
Russia
country.
is in power,
handed
and
over to
Iran
Russia.
is in power, and more Russia now, because the Iranian-Russian relationship is not at its
Okay, let's
best
say
at the
Russian-backed Assad regime is in power.
Well, that makes a huge difference, and that makes a huge difference because now there are lots of Syrians who got involved in the revolution, and they will not stop. It is really sad to hear from you that now we will watch Ghouta full, as we are sitting right now here. It's happening, and we will see Idlib coming next. Probably. And we are kind of just watching. And I would like to say, even saying this is something that outrages me.
I'm just saying what I believe will probably be happening. I'm not saying this is what I want to see happen.
I think I would say this is the first step to accept something that we don't like to see, but we are doing it by just accepting it. That's where I disagree with you. I think we should.
I'm observing.
We should push.
Accepting or not accepting. I'm just seeing
push more for stopping the blood waterfall that we are seeing. We should
totally
push more for stopping these images, not stopping receiving them, stopping them from happening.
But the West doesn't
first
have the
place.
stomach for that fight. They don't want to send troops to be killed.
Who asked for troops to be sent? The West now is willing and ready to shake hands with a criminal.
Well, I want to comment. Actually, Assad is not in power anymore.
These are two
just
different
like
things,
Russia
right?
In power. Okay, I agree with you. Just like they consider Syria as kind of it's part of Russia. They control it. Actually, Assad, he sold Syria to Iran first, then he sold the same Syria to Russia. And what's happening in Ghouta is really it's sad. The bombing, daily bombing, the situation.
Absolutely.
So here we ask the international community to take really responsibility to protect the civilians, because I'm sure 100% like what happened before, Assad forces are like undercover, who are undercover, especially Irani militia like Hezbollah. They will take revenge from the civilians.
Yeah, 350,000 of them estimated in
this is what actually the UN, since a few years, they stopped counting, they stopped making any
citizens inside of Eastern Ghouta.
Yeah, citizens, about 400,000. So we are asking really to protect the civilians, because I'm not talking about fighters, I'm talking about civilians.
Yeah, civilians.
Exactly. So we have to protect them.
Sakar Edris, I want to thank you because we're running short on time. I want to thank as well Yahya Al-Abdullah, James Andre. Stay with us.
Last question, just like I ask also for detainees, political detainees. A lot of political detainees, we don't know anything about them. More than 300,000 we lost. That statistic we also ask, because al-Assad and Iran and Russia, they are using as a political paper to
all those are being
bargain.
kept in,
Political
all those are being
detainees, we
kept
don't
in,
know anything about them. They are under torture now. They are suffering while we are sitting here.
All right.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.